I never believed one careless joke could follow me this far. Yet now I face my husband Adrian in court, with binders of evidence stacked against me like walls I cannot climb. My name is Ione Mercer, and I am 34 years old, working as a receptionist in a small office where I spend my days juggling calls and pretending I am too clever for routine. Adrian is 37 and works as an operations manager, steady and precise, always focused on details I dismissed as dull until they turned against me. We have 2 children, Clara, who is 8 and sharp enough to notice tension, and Jonas, who is 5 and still believes silence means safety. For years, I told myself I was keeping life interesting because Adrian offered stability, but never excitement, and I convinced myself my wit and charm were enough to excuse anything. Callum entered the picture as a distraction, a friend of Adrian's who made me feel noticed and alive, and I fed that feeling with words and actions I later tried to disguise as jokes. The worst moment came during a dinner where I laughed too loudly and announced that even Adrian's boss had tried me, a reckless line I thought would shock and amuse but instead froze the table. Adrian stayed silent, but his silence carried weight I ignored, believing I could laugh away consequences as always. I was wrong, because his silence grew into patience, and that patience gathered receipts, messages, and witness statements until he no longer needed to raise his voice. The day he carried everything into court, I understood too late that the game I thought I controlled had already ended, and I was the one who lost. The dinner where everything began unraveling was supposed to be ordinary because Rachel had suggested a family night at a restaurant to break routine, and I agreed eagerly since I enjoyed being the center of attention. I wore a bright dress that I had recently bought with money Adrian believed went toward school expenses, and I wanted people to notice how confident and lively I appeared compared to his quiet seriousness. At the table, Rachel sat across from me, already ready to laugh at anything I said, while Helen sat near Adrian with her usual stern look that I tried to ignore. A few friends joined, adding more ears for my humor, and I leaned into the role I always played as entertainer, filling silence with sarcasm and remarks that made people laugh nervously. When conversation shifted toward work, stress, and bosses, I felt my chance arrive, so I announced that even Adrian's boss had tried me, treating it like a joke that everyone should laugh at. Rachel immediately clapped her hands and repeated my words loudly, while some of the friends laughed out of awkwardness. But I saw Helen's face freeze, as though I had finally confirmed her worst suspicions about me. Adrian sat motionless, eyes lowered to his glass, and I told myself he was sulking because he lacked humor. So I pushed harder and made more comments about how boring life could be with someone who only thought about rules. A few chuckled, but others exchanged looks that unsettled me, though I brushed them aside because attention felt too good to let go. After dinner, Adrian walked in silence, and when I teased him lightly about his mood, he only muttered that I humiliated him. Words I dismissed quickly because I believed I had control. That night, I overheard him on the phone in the kitchen, speaking with a calmness I did not recognize, asking about witness statements and proper ways to request records. My chest tightened, but I convinced myself he was venting or bluffing because Adrian had always avoided conflict, and I laughed quietly as I told myself he would never dare act. Still, the sound of his even voice carried a weight that followed me into sleep, leaving me uneasy even as I insisted he was too weak to do anything real. The weeks after that dinner felt strange because the air in the house changed in ways I could not quite explain, even though I kept telling myself everything was normal and under my control. At work, I repeated the story in the teacher's lounge because I wanted to keep the laughter alive and prove that people still admired my boldness. I joked again about how even Adrian's boss had tried me, and laughed as if it were the cleverest line I had ever delivered, while some coworkers laughed nervously, and others exchanged knowing glances. I told myself they were jealous of my confidence, and that gossip always followed people who dared to be different. But deep down, I sensed the whispers were not admiration but quiet judgment. When Adrian asked one evening why people at his workplace seemed to know about the dinner, I snapped at him and accused him of being paranoid, saying he embarrassed me with his constant suspicion. He said nothing in response, only gave me one long steady look before walking into his office. and I could hear the sound of drawers opening and papers being stacked with deliberate care. I told myself he was obsessing over nothing, because he always drowned himself in paperwork, but his silence pressed on me heavier than any argument ever had. Rachel called often and told me not to worry, saying Adrian was insecure and trying to make me feel guilty for being outspoken, and she urged me to keep ignoring him. Her encouragement gave me a temporary rush, so I kept repeating the joke to friends, saying my body count and Adrian's pride were both just numbers in games. They laughed at first, but then grew quieter, and I noticed conversations shifting away from me faster than before. Callum started messaging me more during this time, reminding me of the promises I had made to him and pressing me for attention, and I slipped into excuses about errands to meet him briefly. I transferred small amounts from our account again, convincing myself it was harmless since I handled daily expenses anyway and deserved to spend money however I pleased. When Adrian noticed missing funds and asked if I had covered unexpected bills, I quickly claimed the money went toward Clara's school project and groceries. And when he hesitated, I accused him of acting like a controlling husband. He nodded slowly and wrote something in the pad he kept, and his calmness frustrated me more than anger would have, because I could not twist silence the way I twisted words. At the office, co-workers whispered openly now, mentioning my joke as if it carried proof of something real, and one asked slyly if Adrian had ever confronted his boss about me. I laughed it off and said Adrian lacked courage to confront anyone, and I added that he only knew how to bury himself in numbers, a remark that earned forced chuckles but also more stares. Later that night, I saw Adrian scrolling through his phone with a blank face, and I wondered if he had seen messages or posts I thought were private. Martha visited a few days later and told Adrian, in a low voice, that he needed to protect himself, and I caught enough of her tone to know she was urging him to take action. I told myself she was meddling as always, but I could not ignore the way Adrian listened intently, nodding without argument. Rachel laughed when I told her about it, saying Martha was poisoning him, but even she sounded less certain now, pausing before adding that maybe I should tone things down. Callum grew bolder in his texts, saying I should not keep him waiting and reminding me of what I owed him, and I sent another transfer while convincing myself Adrian would never piece it together. But his silence felt different each evening, less like sulking and more like planning, and when I peeked at his desk one night, I saw neat stacks of papers with highlighted lines and clipped receipts. My heart raced, but I closed the drawer quickly and told myself he was bluffing, collecting scraps to scare me, but the weight of those organized folders lingered in my chest. Clara noticed the tension too, because she asked if I was in trouble, and I told her adults just argued sometimes, but her frown made me uneasy. Jonas clung to Adrian more often now, following him into his office and sitting quietly nearby. And I hated the way Adrian welcomed him in while keeping me outside. Each day felt like walking across thin glass because I kept pretending I was in control while evidence piled up in silence. And I realized the joke I once thought so harmless had opened a door I could no longer close. The neighborhood barbecue arrived just as summer settled in, and I told myself it was the perfect chance to reset everything and show people I still held control of the story. I dressed carefully in a new outfit purchased with money Adrian believed went toward children's supplies, and I walked into the backyard, determined to shine as the lively wife who could keep everyone laughing. I greeted neighbors loudly, laughed with friends, and made sure attention circled back to me, because I believed confidence would drown out the whispers I had started. When people asked about work, I slid into my usual role of entertainer, retelling stories with exaggeration until laughter spread across the tables. And then I pushed further by mocking Adrian. I called him serious and boring, saying life with him felt like living with a calculator, and a few people chuckled politely, while others glanced at each other in discomfort. I did not stop, because once I felt eyes on me, I could not resist going further, and I repeated the joke about his boss as if it were harmless humor, saying again that even his superior had tried me once. This time the laughter was more strained, and I saw heads turn toward Adrian, who stood by the grill with his arms crossed, answering brief questions about food, but never looking at me. I told myself his silence made him appear weak, so I pushed harder, joking about numbers and body counts being just games, treating them as meaningless tallies while forcing a smile. The children ran across the yard while adults whispered, and I noticed Clara standing nearby watching me with wide eyes, clearly having overheard enough to feel confused and hurt. Later that evening, as people sat in circles with plates of food, I overheard other children whispering to Clara about things they had heard from their parents, and her face flushed before she turned away. My stomach tightened, but I forced my smile wider, telling myself I would deal with her questions later, and instead, I laughed louder at my own stories, so others would not sense weakness. When the night ended, I walked up to Adrian and said he embarrassed me by staying silent and sulking, but he gave me no reply, only a long, steady look before walking away. At home, I found an envelope on the counter, labeled simply evidence, and when I opened it, my hands trembled. Inside were copies of receipts, transfers, and statements that I had convinced myself were hidden, each page highlighted in neat lines with dates and amounts clearly marked. My first reaction was to laugh bitterly and call it bluffing, telling myself he was trying to scare me with scraps of paper. But the calm handwriting suggested something far more deliberate. I shoved the envelope beneath a pile of magazines, determined not to let him see fear in my eyes, and I walked upstairs, rehearsing excuses in case he confronted me. That night, Clara asked quietly if rumors were true, and I brushed it off by saying children should not listen to gossip, but the disappointment in her face lingered long after she went to bed. Jonas clung to Adrian as they read together, and the image of the two of them seated in calm silence cut deeper than any argument. I lay awake replaying the evening, remembering the forced laughter of neighbors and the pitying glances directed at Adrian, and I felt unease coil in my chest. The joke that once gave me power now felt like a weapon turned against me, because people no longer laughed with me, but instead looked at him with sympathy and me with suspicion. I told myself again that he would never act, that he lacked courage, but the envelope of organized receipts whispered otherwise, and the sound of his steady pen scratching late into the night filled me with dread I refused to admit aloud. The weeks after the barbecue felt heavier than I expected, because whispers followed me everywhere, and the envelope of receipts hidden under magazines weighed on me like a stone I could not move. At work in the office break room, people no longer pretended not to gossip, and I caught my name spoken in low tones, followed by sharp laughter that was not friendly but mocking. One colleague asked directly if I had really said that Adrian's boss had tried me, and I forced a laugh while insisting it was a silly joke twisted out of context. I told them Adrian was insecure and obsessed with control, framing myself as the victim of his constant seriousness. But their flat expressions showed they no longer believed me the way they once had. Meanwhile, Callum grew impatient, sending me messages late at night, reminding me of the favors I had promised him and pressing me for more money, which I sent in small transfers under the excuse of household spending. Each time I moved money, I told myself Adrian would never connect the dots because he hated confrontation. Yet each evening, he spent longer in his office, calmly organizing papers while I listened from the hallway. His silence unsettled me more than shouting could, because I could not twist silence into something that benefited me. Helen arrived one afternoon and caught me in the driveway, speaking with sharp eyes that left no space for excuses. She told me Adrian deserved better and that my behavior was already breaking the children, and I tried to laugh it off, saying she had always despised me, but her gaze did not shift. Later, I told Rachel about it, and she exploded in anger, saying Helen was meddling again and trying to poison Adrian against me. But even Rachel's voice carried hesitation when she admitted quietly that I should probably stop repeating that joke. Their tension boiled over at a family dinner when Helen confronted me directly, telling everyone that Adrian needed to protect himself, while Rachel shouted back that Adrian was controlling me and humiliating me with his paranoia. The children sat silently through the fight, Clara pushing food around her plate without eating, and Jonas leaning against Adrian with wide, confused eyes. That sight stung more than Helen's words, because I realized the children were beginning to see me not as playful, but as unstable. I tried to reassure them afterward that arguments were normal, but Clara looked at me with doubt that I could not erase. A few days later, I came home to find Adrian sitting at the dining table with a man carrying a briefcase. The man introduced himself politely as Adrian's lawyer, placing a stack of documents neatly in front of them, and began explaining things in calm, formal language that made my stomach turn. I wanted to shout that Adrian was destroying our family over nonsense, but my throat felt dry as I stared at stamps, signatures, and legal phrasing that left no room for laughter. Adrian did not look at me once, instead listening carefully and signing where the lawyer pointed, his steady expression making me feel invisible in my own home. When the meeting ended, I tried to laugh again and told myself it was only a bluff meant to scare me, but the weight of that lawyer's calm voice echoed in my mind long after they left. For the first time, I understood that Adrian was not simply gathering papers to sulk, but building something real and official that I could not control with charm or excuses, and that realization left me more shaken than I dared admit even to Rachel. When the lawyer left that evening, I stood frozen in the kitchen pretending the papers on the table meant nothing, but inside, I felt a pressure growing that I could not shake, no matter how many times I repeated to myself that Adrian was bluffing. Over the next week, his routine became colder and more deliberate because he spent nearly every evening in his office with binders and files neatly arranged, speaking on the phone with a steady calmness that made me feel like an outsider in my own house. I tried confronting him by saying he was ruining the family over a joke, but he refused to answer me directly and only reminded me through his lawyer that financial dishonesty and public humiliation were no longer tolerable. That silence made me furious, so I turned to gaslighting, accusing him of letting his mother control him and saying Helen had poisoned his mind against me. But Adrian never raised his voice, and his stillness cut deeper than anger. I attempted tears one night, sobbing that he was betraying me by speaking to strangers about our marriage, yet he only slid a document toward me that listed withdrawals and transfers with my name beside each one. I shoved it back at him, insisting numbers could be misread, but my voice sounded hollow even to myself. Rachel continued telling me that he would never follow through because divorces were expensive and ugly, yet her tone grew weaker every time I told her about stamped documents and official letters. Callum grew colder as well, sending me impatient messages saying he wanted more money and attention. And when I hesitated, he hinted he might distance himself altogether. I sent him another transfer out of fear of losing him, and afterward, I sat trembling because I knew Adrian had already caught those trails. At work, the gossip became impossible to ignore because people had seen Adrian's online posts where he began sharing his evidence. He never ranted or insulted me, but simply posted images of receipts, bank transfers, and highlighted notes with captions like, "Clarity matters," or "Numbers do not lie." Those simple words spread faster than any story I could tell, and friends who once encouraged my boldness now looked away when I entered a room. Neighbors whispered openly, co-workers avoided inviting me to lunch, and parents at the school watched me with tight smiles that carried judgment behind them. I wanted to fight back, but anything I said would sound desperate because the proof was already in front of everyone. Helen praised Adrian publicly, telling people he was finally protecting himself and the children, and I could see the satisfaction in her face whenever we crossed paths. Rachel tried to defend me once more, but even she faltered when people showed her the receipts Adrian had shared, and she admitted quietly that maybe he was right to act. Clara grew distant, choosing to sit beside her father during meals, and Jonas refused to sleep unless Adrian was near, both of them slowly turning toward him as their safe place. I hated that shift because I felt my connection with them fading, yet I could not stop it because the more I spoke, the less they trusted me. Each evening, the binders grew thicker, filled with evidence I once believed could stay hidden, and each morning, his online posts reached further until I felt like every corner of my life was under quiet surveillance. I realized then that Adrian's revenge was not built on anger, but on patience and order, and that made it more devastating because I had no weapon against it. My laughter, my sarcasm, my excuses, none of it mattered anymore when every number, every receipt, every transfer stood like a wall between us. By the time another letter arrived from his lawyer, outlining custody considerations and financial protections, I knew the process had already moved beyond me, and all I could do was watch as the life I once controlled slipped steadily into his hands. The final stage of everything came quietly, but carried the weight of a hammer, because Adrian no longer treated me as his wife, but as someone already written out of his life. He moved with calm precision through every day, speaking with his lawyer, gathering papers into neat binders, and refusing to answer any of my attempts to pull him into an argument. At first, I tried to convince myself that he would eventually break down and talk to me, but instead, he insisted everything should go through legal channels, which made me feel like a stranger living in my own home. Rachel stopped calling as often because she admitted she could not defend me against documents that spoke louder than words, and she began avoiding my questions when I asked if she still believed I was right. Helen grew bolder, standing at family gatherings with quiet triumph and telling Adrian he had done well to protect himself, and though her words stung, they carried more truth than I could deny. The children told the story most clearly because Clara barely looked at me anymore and stayed close to Adrian with trust in her eyes, while Jonas clung to him at bedtime and whispered questions about whether things would change. Adrian reassured them softly, his calm voice carrying a strength I never admitted before, and I watched as they leaned into him completely, choosing his truth over my excuses. At work, the humiliation grew sharper because Adrian's posts continued spreading, each one a simple photo of a receipt or a transfer with a short caption like "Clarity Matters," and people no longer laughed when I entered the room. Parents at the school glanced at me with pity and judgment. Co-workers excluded me from their conversations, and friends who once encouraged my boldness stopped returning my calls. I considered making a long post defending myself, saying Adrian twisted everything, but I knew it would collapse instantly because the proof was already too heavy. The moment I feared most arrived when Adrian asked both families to meet at the courthouse, saying all explanations would be given there. I entered the courtroom, trembling, while he walked in with steady steps carrying a thick binder, his lawyer beside him, and the children seated with Helen on one side. My parents sat stiffly behind me, already uneasy from whispers they had heard, and Rachel lowered her eyes when I looked at her, offering no defense. Adrian placed the binder on the table and began sliding pages across, each one stamped and signed, each one carrying receipts, transfers, and highlighted notes that tied directly to me. He included bank statements, screenshots of my messages to Callum, and even copies of my own words, dismissing his questions with flimsy excuses. My parents sat in stunned silence, flipping page after page, their faces growing heavier with every document, while Rachel remained silent because even she could not twist what lay before us. I tried to claim that Adrian was betraying me by airing private matters, but my voice sounded small in the courtroom, and the judge reminded me that evidence, not feelings, would decide. The children sat quietly beside Adrian, Clara leaning against his arm, Jonas clutching his sleeve, and their trust in him cut deeper than any ruling. The judge read through the evidence carefully and then confirmed custody arrangements in Adrian's favor, explaining that financial protection and stability must come first. I felt my chest tighten as the words echoed, because I realized in that moment that every laugh, every sarcastic remark, and every reckless transfer had led directly here. Adrian did not gloat or raise his voice. He simply gathered the binder, thanked his lawyer, and stood with the children beside him, his dignity restored in full view of everyone. That silence carried more weight than any punishment I could imagine, because it meant I had lost not through a fight but through truth I could no longer deny. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.